Welcome to VarnVlog Solo, and we continue our What is Politics series on the Republic, which is part of a longer series on Plato, which is a part of an even longer series on the shape of ancient political thought. Now, we need to kind of get into two of the most important books in Plato's Republic because they contain two of the most famous allegories. If you think about the paradoxes that emerged in Book 5, which is a crucial turning point in the entire structure of the Republic, you can see that a question emerges. If philosophers are uniquely qualified to rule, then why, in actuality, are philosophers in Athens regarded as either completely useless, eccentric weirdos, or worse, dangerous, corrupting, irreligious malcontents, or even worse, sophists? So Socrates sets out to answer the question. He agrees that the public perception of philosophers are quite bad, but argues that the fault is with the corrupt nature of existing cities, not philosophy itself, which, set off progressives and whatnot like I.F. Stone back in the day. So to prove this, Plato has Socrates rely on a metaphor, which is the ship of state. And this actually has metaphysical and epistemological implications, so we're going to have to tease it out carefully. So when trying to figure out how the philosopher-kings would actually operate, we get the analogy of the ship of state and the divided line. So Adeimantus, remember, one of Plato's actual real-life brothers, interrupts Socrates to point out that philosophers are generally seen as useless or wicked. Socrates responds with this allegory to illustrate how democracy degrades true expertise and wisdom. And he says, imagine a ship where the shipowner is big and strong, but a bit deaf, short-sighted, and severely lacking in navigation skills. The crew fight constantly with one another for control of the helm. They haven't studied navigation, and they claim it cannot be taught. They use raw force, drugs, and wine to bypass and paralyze the ship owner, seizing the rudder. The sailors praise whoever is best at helping them trick or force the ship owner into taking the steer. They call this person a master navigator, even though he knows nothing of the wind, stars, or seasons. He's just a good orator. The person who actually understands the navigation must spend his time studying the sky, the seasons, and the stars, because he isn't fighting for the rudder. The crew mocks him as a useless stargazer or a lunatic. Now, in this allegory, everyone represents something else. So it's generally how the ship owner represents the citizenry of Athens, who actually are the owners of the state. The crew is the politicians empowered by that citizenry. Although, remember, Athens is a more direct democracy than, say, the Roman Senatorial Republic or what we have in the United States, with the exception of the fact that very few citizens could actually participate in Athens. There were very few citizens, I mean. Not that citizens themselves were disqualified. It's just not that many people counted as citizens. So the captain is basically whoever is the most verbally skilled, and this clearly seems aimed at Pericles or Alcibiades. And then the true stargazer, who actually understands the stars enough to navigate by them, is seen as a lunatic because he's not interested in the immediate politics of getting the rudder. He's interested in actually steering the ship. The implication of this allegory is that politicians win power through persuasion and demagoguery, but they don't know justice because they haven't studied it in any significant way. And the true philosopher is useless in the city only because he refuses to participate in this chicanery, and thus the city does not use his knowledge. So this is an argument for a almost technocratic expertise. Socrates notes that a true philosophical mind requires a rare combination of traits in this chapter as well. Quickness of mind, love of truth, courage, high-mindedness, and moderation, all of which are implied in that noble lie, actually, that you have these traits that emerge from, these emotional impulses in your soul, your spiritedness, your logical inquisitiveness, and your control of your own appetites. These lead to these virtues. But Plato also notes, or has Socrates note, that the best natures are also easiest to corrupt. When a brilliant youth grows up in an existing city, public opinion, particularly all the people are cheering in the assembly, the theaters, and the courts, will pressure said person to conform. The sophist, according to Plato's Socrates, merely mirror back what the crowd wants to hear, teaching the passions of the great beast and exacerbating them. Consequently, the most gifted minds abandon philosophy for wealth or political fame, leaving philosophy vulnerable to second-rate hacks. In fact, I think the phrase from the Republic is thinkers who barely escape prison, who then discredit the field. So this leads to this idea that to know what it means to be a good ruler, one must be a good philosopher, but a specific kind of philosopher. Glaucon, following up on Adeimantus, asks if we can know what the ultimate knowledge is. And Socrates basically reveals it as agathou are the form of the good. Socrates admits he cannot define the good directly, so he offers another analogy. This one is the analogy of the sun. So the sun gives light to the world, and that light makes visible objects, but you should not actually look at the sun directly. It would blind you. So to the good enables truth to be manifest in the mind, and that gives us the knowable forms that we can identify in the world. So the geometric logic that is epistemologically founded for Socrates and Plato is so deep that it's actually seen as metaphysically real. This is one of my great arguments with a lot of philosophies in science and math is I don't believe that numbers are forms that exist in the universe. I think they are analogous to things when you remove quantification. So they are real in that things exist in the world in a quantifiable manner, but they are abstracted from the world of being as such and make sense in terms of the structures in our mind that way. Kind of a mixture of observation and semiotic structure leading to math, not forms of numbers existing in the universe in some ultimately real way. This makes almost all the math philosophy people that I know uncomfortable, including some of the nominalists, because I do actually imply that math isn't entirely made up. Like it's not just a human construction. It is something that once humans can do certain kinds of operations, such as extracting out other qualities, would emerge somewhat consistently with different bases and different counting forms. But basically, the ability to talk about abstracts that way would be universal. All right. So the analogy here is that the sun is a source of light. Without it, our eyes possess. Without it, Our eyes possess the faculty of sight, but they can see nothing. So the sun is responsible for the generation, growth, and nourishment of life itself and our ability to see it. The analogy here by Plato is that the good is what radiates truth and being throughout the world. Without it, the human mind possesses the faculty of reason, but it can only form doxa, or passing opinions, about changing the world. It cannot understand the world enough to control it. When the mind focuses on things illuminated by the good, it has genuine knowledge, and that genuine knowledge is where our understanding of the world comes from, and thus we can start to change the world. This is an idea. This is the beginning in the Western context of a clear, articulated form of idealism. There are prior forms of idealism to Plato. He does not invent it. But this idea of emanated knowledges and knowledges being more real than experience, and this, that, and the other. There are similar things in other philosophies. If you've ever studied Vedanta and Maya, as I mentioned in the episode, this is pretty analogous to that. But it's definitely a metaphysical argument. Anyway, Plato is telling us that the good is not just the source of our knowledge of the forms. It's the source of their existence and being, just like our ability to see life is from the sun, but also life existing is because of the sun. So just as life, and just like the life is born of the sun's warmth, the sun is separate from and superior to the object and illuminates, but also is how the object and illuminates can even exist. So the good stands beyond being, and thus beyond dignity and power, even though it has dignity and power as the source of both life and our ability to understand life metaphysically. That is the allegory of the sun. Now, you can make of it what you will, but that's when the total idealist nature of all this really, really becomes undeniable. Then we get the divided line analogy. So Plato starts to wonder about how we talk about the lowest forms of ignorance to understanding the form of the good, because this is crucial to understanding what a philosopher should be. And this is where he comes up with the divided line analogy. He says, imagine a world or a vertical line cut into two unequal parts. The lower section represents the visible world of doxa. Well, he doesn't say of doxa, but the visible world is equated to doxa. And the upper section represents the intelligible world of actual knowledge. Each section is cut again in the same ratio, creating four distinct cognitive stages. First is gnosis, a pure understanding. And that, excuse me, I should probably go from the visible realm. First is physis, our convention of belief, which corresponds to physical things. There is also akasia, our imagination illusion, which corresponds to shadows, reflections, images, and artistic representations. Ikasia is probably the lowest form of doxa in the visible realm. Then there's physis, which is where conviction or belief comes from. This, if you've ever read about Gnostic Christianity, is what the Gnostic Christianities call a lot of conventional Christians, is people who have physis, who have conviction or belief about truth, and that truth for them is the ultimate wisdom of Sophia, manifested through Christos, or Christ. But all this Gnostic stuff is purely traceable to Plato. And honestly, it's hard to know if we can call Gnostic Christianity just anything more than a syncretism, a very weird syncretism of Neoplatonism and various forms of early Christianity. And in fact, saying Gnostic Christianity is a coherent category is itself scholastically contested. But if you want to encounter these sections from the Republic again, you actually encounter them the most in Neoplatonic and in Gnostic literature. Then you get into the intelligible realm, where you get dianoia, which is mathematical reasoning, which is geometric objects which emerge from the faculty of the mind. And then you get gnosis, which is pure being, a pure understanding, which comes from pure forms, and it is learned dialectically. It moves from form to form without sensory aid. You can understand it by understanding the opposition and the manifestation of these forms. So this gives you the divided line. So just to go back over what is implied by this, the visible world is made up of ikasia, or imagination illusion, which is the lowest form of awareness. The mind looks at copies of mere physical things. Shadows, reflections, are illusions, peddled by artists, poets, and politicians, and it takes those shadows for reality. Then you have physis, which is conviction or belief, which the mind turns around to look directly at the physical objects, trees, animals, manufactured goods. This is a realm of practical common sense. It is a step up from the shadows because the beliefs are based on something that actually exists, but it is still limited and shifting because it's based in just your opinions or emotions about the unstable material world. And according to Plato/Socrates, or Plato-Socrates, it takes the shadow for, it takes the shadow for reality when you're just in the realm of illusion. But even when you're a little better in Pisces, it can yield beliefs but not certainty. It's not even justified true beliefs. Which is one of the things that we deal with later on in Plato when he tries to say what knowledge is to be based on, justified true belief. Then the intelligible world, which is understandable but not directly sensate, right? So you get dianoia, which was basically mathematical reason or geometric reasoning, where the mind starts to see abstracts. The abstracts are more real than the physical world that inspired them. Diagrams, are manifestations of beginning to represent abstract concepts that exist in the universe, like the form of a triangle. But dianoia has a limitation. It relies on unproven assumptions or hypotheses to operate. If you've ever done a geometric thesis or proof, you know how this works. You have to accept the axioms as given, and thus accepting the definitions to work out the abstractions. It doesn't necessarily tell you if the abstractions are real, which brings us to gnosis, which is the ultimate stage of understanding for Plato. We might say the ultimate stage of cognition, even. Using dialectics, the mind tests hypothesis not as final truths, but as mere stepping stones or launching pads, but between oppositional truths. And it travels upwards to an unhypothetical first principle. And for Plato, that first principle is the form of the good. Once you grasp this principle, it can navigate down through the entire web of forms purely on their own terms, completely free of sensory assistance. So Glaucon and Adeimantus are told that basically to shift our conception of politics, we have to shift our conception of metaphysics and epistemology. The true ruler is not a pragmatic manager or an orator. They're a philosopher. And they're a philosopher who can use these various skills, including mathematical reasoning, to start to approach pure truth. Now, this allegory is or this analogy is actually going to be crucial to the next allegory, which is the most famous Platonic allegory period, the allegory of the pay. But it helps to understand the implications of the divided line, and the sensory versus the intelligible world, and the levels of awareness to understand what the allegory of the cave is getting at, because the allegory of the cave is literally trying to illustrate this and tie this back into the noble lie myth about everyone being born in the earth. One will notice that Plato's allegories and myths are all said, many of them are said to be based on a lie, but the lie is supposed to be trying to get at some kind of deeper truth, which is exactly what he doesn't like poets for, because he thinks that they include too much negativity and misform the populace by that negativity. Which brings us to book 7, which is probably the most read part of the Republic. Some see it as a climax. I actually don't. One of the things I will say about this is, even though it's the most read, it does not. People do not read it as tying into the earth birth part of the noble lie, and not even always is it taught in light of the allegory of the sun and the divided line, even though the sun and the divided line are implied in the allegory of the cave. So we have this abstract geometric architecture at the end of book 6. So Plato wants this to be teachable, so he takes it to what is probably, as I've said, the most famous Platonic narrative, the allegory of the cave. So what is interesting about the allegory of the cave is, outside of this insistence to change our understanding of politics, we have to change our understanding of epistemology, morality, and metaphysics. This is actually a pivot back to the practical concerns of the Republic. So this is part of this higher education curriculum that he hinted at earlier, and part of the myth he's going to tell people about the metal souls. So the idea here is that, we're all born of earth and blah, blah, blah. But then if you take that and develop this out in the allegory of the cave with this divided line in the sun analogies, this allegory really does tie all these things together. So Socrates asked Glaucon to imagine a cave-like dwelling with a long entrance open to the light. And then he says that from childhood, the human beings are chained by their legs and necks, and they're forced to look only at the back wall of the cave. And behind them, a fire burns. Between the fire and the prisoners, there's a raised path with puppet handlers carrying all sorts of artifacts, statues of man, animals, and trees projected upon the wall. The prisoners cannot see themselves, and thus cannot recognize anything beyond the projections, because they have no way to see themselves or others like them to have as a baseline of recognition, and they cannot see the objects behind them or the fire. They can only see the shadows projected onto the wall. If they speak to one another, they assume they are naming actual realities, but all they are naming is shadows. If echoes bounce off the wall, they believe the shadows are speaking. To the prisoners, truth is nothing more than the shadows of artificial objects. This is that first part of the divided line in the sensate world, the illusionary part. Then Socrates imagines a prisoner being violently unchained and forced to stand up, turn around, and look into the light of the fire. Now, we're still in the sensory world, but at least now you're looking at the actual objects. And this movement is intensely painful because the glare of the fire hurts. He's been in darkness all his life, only looking at shadows. If someone tells him what he saw before was a worthless illusion and points to the actual puppets passing by, he will be confused and try to turn back, because all he knows is the comfortable, sharp shadows that he could easily see. While looking at the fire, after being in darkness all his life, how would he actually be able to adjust? He would, but it would take a while. Then he is dragged up steep, rugged stairs out of the cave entirely and forced to look into the bright sunlight of the actual world. He is traumatized by this because if the fire was too bright, imagine what the sun looks like. And in fact, for a while, he's effectively blinded. But then he sees the true world, the liberated prisoner must adjust in stages, mirroring the transitions of the divided line. First, he looks at shadows and reflections of things in the water. Next, he looks at the physical things themselves. But then he adjusts enough to look upon the sun directly, realizing it is the source of the seasons, what makes the world visible in the first place, and the source of everything he once saw inside the cave, including the fire, which made the projections possible. Now, if you think about this, it's about like becoming aware, becoming more integrated into the physical world, then ascending into the intelligible world, becoming aware of the geometric forms through mathematics, then being able to look at those forms, those lower forms through mathematics. Then he's finally able to look directly at the sun because he's adjusted his life. He can't look too long. It'll still blind him if he looks directly for too long, but he can see enough to tell that the sun is actually where the seasons are coming from, the light comes from, it's the ultimate source of heat, etc., etc. So, remembering his old home, the liberated philosopher now pities his fellow prisoners who still compete for honors and prizes based on who can best predict the secrets of passing shadows upon the wall. If he descends back into the cave to free them, his eyes will be unaccustomed to the darkness. He will stumble around ridiculously because he sees the true world and now he's back in a dark one. The prisoners will laugh at him because he can't steady himself and conclude that his descent up and out of the cave ruined his eyesight, and that it isn't even worth trying to escape from the comfort of the projections on the wall. Socrates notes dryly that anyone who tries to unchain the prisoners and lead them up, they would eventually catch the man and kill him, which is a direct bit of dramatic irony for the reader who knows what's going to happen to Socrates, and also implicates this piece as still being concerned with the death of Socrates. Well, then Glaucon intervenes here and he asks the question, and this is often where the people who are reading this dialogue in high school, if they read it in high school, I taught it in high school for a while. We don't talk about this part. But Glaucon's question is it unfair to force a philosopher who has escaped the cave and enjoying the contemplation of eternal truth to go back down to the darkness to rule? And Socrates responds, we are not, basically, we are not engineering the state to make one class exceptionally happy, but to ensure harmony and happiness of all. Therefore, it is a duty upon the philosopher who has liberated himself with the petty concerns of the world to go back to the world so that he can liberate everyone. Now, if this sounds like Mahayana Buddhism to you, it does to me too. So, there's a book by Thomas McEvilley called The Shape of Ancient Thought, which actually does compare Sinic Buddhist and ancient Greek thought. And that got me looking at the work of Richard Seifert, who even does this and looks at it in terms of like property law developments and the changes of state forms in India and the Hellenic world. I would tell people to look at that for this, to contextualize that there probably is a little bit of something to this idea in the ancient world, because it doesn't just occur to Plato. And Plato's not the only source of it. And we see this all over the place. So a couple of things come up. One is the city made the philosopher's education possible. So because of that, the philosopher does owe a debt to the polis to continue the polis being able to function. They also must rule because it's a duty. They actually should not want power. So Socrates notes that the only city that is stable and free of civil war is one where the rulers are deeply reluctant to rule, because people who want to rule for their own advantage will have the rapine increase that leads to the problems of the city of absolute necessity becoming the corrupted city of expansion. And by the way, that's also, the myth of Atlantis comes up around some of these things. We'll get to that eventually. Those who chase political office because they want to feed their own appetites. are using power for the wrong way, and this will lead to stasis, which in the Greek term is basically a civil war. So the next question comes up is, how do we get the soul to move from darkness to light? And Socrates actually lays down a 15-year curriculum of abstract science designed to break the mind's reliance on physical sensation and force it into abstract thought. So he actually has an age for all this. So between ages of 20 and 30, a person should first develop an understanding of arithmetics and numbers. Then they need to understand plane geometry. So understanding the planes of physical shapes, which starts to get you to think towards abstraction, and thus learning that there are truths beyond just the rational faculty and empirical observation. Then this leads you to solid geometry, so you can think of three-dimensional spaces such as spheres and cubes. And he says that at the time that he's writing, actually, that 3 dimensions are neglected because the state doesn't value them. They need to understand astronomy, not just because the beauty of stars, but the movements of celestial bodies create visible diagrams to calculate the underlying laws of the pure motion and mathematical ratios as manifested in the world, thus tying your understanding of abstract geometry back to the physical world. And then you study harmonics and music theory, looking for ratios, because ratios are audible in consonants and chords, making clear that mathematical harmony actually does have an effect in the physical universe. Then between ages 30 and 35, after 10 years of rigorous math study, and this is after the basics of basic math and language learning and learning practical skills that you do between 0 and 20, the elite of the people taught mathematics will study the dialectic, which is the philosophical tool of Plato. Dialectic allows thinkers to take apart false hypotheses, climb up hypotheticals based on abstract principles, to start seeing the beginnings of reality, the good, and then navigate the realm of pure ideas without using any images, senses, or physical models anymore. You can drop away the mathematical logic. So book 7 thus ends with a somewhat rigid chronological timeline for the implementation of how you build a philosopher class, and thus a philosopher-king at the very top. Childhood to age 20, everybody undergoes education in poetry, gymnastics, introductory mathematics, and military training. So, the practical skills, the appetites, the bronze and iron. Then those who are good enough in the former will be integrated in the mathematical and scientific training because of their abilities in basic education from childhood age 20. So this is 20 to 30. Then after 5 years of extensive exclusive training in the dialectics and in art and opposing ideas abstractly, the philosophers are then asked to go back into the messy world of politics, military command, and administration to test their character against real-world temptations and hardships, and to apply the abstract knowledge that they've acquired in the first 35 years. Those who survive the practical application and still manage to do contemplation of the good and take turns going back to civic obligation, the best of whom can rise up to the guardian class or to the philosopher-king. This is how Socrates, Socrates anyway, imagines how a philosopher's king would establish the education and would create more philosopher kings to replace them. They must enter an existing city, banish everyone over the age of 10 into the countryside, and raise the remaining children from scratch in complete isolation from the prior educational system. Now, this is a utopian blueprint. I don't think anyone would argue that it isn't. But the Chaopolis here is absolute, and Plato then with this metaphor as showing how he would tie what we now call sociology and psychology to metaphysics and epistemology and pedagogy or education into a coherent system to make a viable politics. This is the idea. And it is mathematically elegant from Plato's perspective because everything mirrors everything else. The development of the individual mirrors the development of the city. The passions and virtues that emerge from the passions are aligned and control and mirror the stages of education and city. The myth of being born on the earth is mirrored and actualized through the educational form of first training people in the basic skills of the earth, etc., etc., etc. The prior kinship bands are replaced by kinship to the polis itself, which are done by declaring everyone in certain age groups your parents. And this makes this possible because there's a real possibility everyone in those age groups are actually the parents. So this ties everything together. These analogies, now, I'm not sure we can say that these are super viable analogies. They're not how I think the world works at all. But these analogies are how you tie the development of the tripartite soul, the development of the different parts of the civic virtue, and the development of our understanding of the metaphysical world all together, and they mirror each other for Plato. Now, you will note that Hegel seems to have pulled a lot from this. So let's go into what dialectics means, though, for Plato, because it doesn't mean the same thing that it does for Hegel. Hegel dialectics, even though it's a manifestation of idea, is both metaphysicalized in the absolute idea, expresses negatively so it can't affect human freedom, and it's basically Christian, so that it is set in a framework of both secular and religious history, with an eschatological end being possible. Although Plato doesn't talk about the end state and all that, that actually comes from Kojève. Kojeve's reading of Plato. But Plato in Book 7 really crowns the dialectic as this center stone of the guardian's education and of the possibility of creating a philosophy-king. He also thinks it's super potentially dangerous, which is why you have to go through the mathematical training and the practical training first to even see if you could touch it. It's kind of like the way like religious Jews view Kabbalah. And by the way, there's ties to Kabbalah to Platonism if you study its historical core. But anyway, so the dialectic is in contrast with heuristic or heuristique, which is a competitive method of debate practiced by the sophists, and is often actually in some places also referred to as a dialectic. The reason why Plato sets up a distinction is he wants to think his dialectic is also dialogic. So you have the oppositional, but largely, according to Plato, superficial debate practiced by the sophist that is aimed at dominating public life through, knowingly faulty arguments. And he says the heuristique looks like the dialectic, but it has a completely different purpose. So the core goal of the dialectic and the philosopher is to discover objective universal truths by abstracting hypotheticals and leading to more and more abstract contemplation. Whereas the heuristic form of the dialectic, or the heuristic, practiced by the sophist, is just to win an argument in a way that convinces the crowd to give you power, prestige, or money. The goal of the dialectic is to get rid of doxa and definitions and false assumptions or illusions by destroying hypotheses abstractly. Whereas the target of the heuristic debate is the opponent's ego. Excuse me. The medium is pure abstract thought, completely independent of the senses, and even the debates are often done in abstracts. And if you've ever read a Platonic debate, you can see how everyone just kind of folds to Socrates. Some of the arguments are really easy to defeat, actually, but this method of writing becomes pretty dominant. I mean, you see it as late as Boethius. The heuristic is concerned with the tools of rhetoric, so tricks, semantic traps, emotive speeches, emotive manipulation. For Plato, the dialectic, if used correctly, would lead to civic virtue, inner psychic harmony, or eudaimonia, and internal clarity. Whereas the outcome of the heuristic is skepticism, moral relativism, and cynicism. Now, this is interesting because there are some Socratic groups, including some groups of skeptics, who claim Socrates as their founder because of the method at hand. So the dialectic comes from the word diegesis, which means to discourse. In fact, it's also the same origin word of dialogue. But dialogue does not have a specific purpose. So the dialectic is a particular kind of dialogue. And the idea here is that when mathematicians work, they rely on hypotheses. They treat assumptions as evident first principles, and they try to work through what they would mean if you go through them. They don't justify these assumptions. They build downward from them to draw geometric conclusions. And remember, Plato's logic is largely geometrical, including in the Republic. It takes a hypothesis or a definition and treats it not as an absolute truth, but as a temporary stepping stone or a launching pad to get to the next phase of logic. And through systemic questioning, the definition gets refined and tested against contradictions. And since the law of non-contradiction determines truth and harmony, contradictory reasons can be thrown out. The dialectic's goal is to destroy flawed hypotheses, clearing away false knowledge for more stable forms. The process is supposed to eventually lead one to discarding all the forms that you don't need until you get to an unhypothetical first principle, which is a form of a good. If you think this mirrors Aristotle's thought, Aristotle goes in a completely different way. It is not nearly this ideal. However, this principle of dialectic is used there too. So the dialectic here means that you can use dialogue to cast away bad logic and start seeing the interconnected realm of lower forms, which gets you thinking about pure ideas without using diagrams, sensory images, or metaphors, which are necessary as pedagogical tools, but are distortions. And heuristic debate is a counterfeit of this. So one of the things that Socrates says explicitly in Book 7 as almost a way to absolve the charges against him corrupting the youth. There's still stuff. We're still relitigating the death of Socrates in the Republic, even though it's a middle period work. He says that dialectic should never be taught to the young. In fact, he compares introducing even a 20-year-old to a dialectic to a foster child who discovers their parents are not their biological mother and father. If they discover this before they mature enough to find their real parents, they will lose all respect for their foster family and abound in traditional morals, thus ending up lawless. So when young people are exposed to the dialectic too early, they use it as a game of intellectual domination and demolition. They learn how to contradict everything, tearing down civic virtue and religious belief without having the philosophical maturity to rebuild any genuine understanding of objective goodness. Thus, they can fall into sophistry. Thus implying that sophistry is partly a result of studying the dialectic too young. This is implied in Book 7. To prevent this, this is why Plato actually says you can't study the dialectic till you've done 10 years of math and you're at least 30. And that also means by this time you've done some useful military service and stuff like that too. Now, what does book 7 say about intellectual decay? Because it seems to be awfully concerned with it. Well, it just implies that and leaves it up to book 8. So, we'll get into that in our next episode because it's been going 45 minutes long because of the weight of all the allegories and analogies. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. You can find more behind the Patreon wall at www.patreon.com/VarnVlog, and you can get access for as little as $4. I do more teaching stuff. I'm expanding my teaching stuff all the time. We're also doing seminars now. The first one has successfully come out. If you don't have that but like to have some of my work, you can buy my book with Daniel Tutt from Rebo Plus about the problems of left populism and the strategy and beginning to theoretically think about the strategies therein. We'll also say it's an 80-page book, so don't expect it to cover everything you want. There probably will be sequels to this book. Daniel is writing some stuff on class analysis himself privately. He can talk about that. I don't want to out his work, but he's mentioned it with me before. And I am working on some stuff on forms of strategy and social reproduction in the working class that deals with things like, racial tension, the mass line, the merger thesis in more detail, why left populism is too damn nebulous to even contradict, because what's claimed as left populist gets moved around, blah, blah, blah. You can find more about that. And we're going to continue this word as politics. These themselves, I originally had planned to do a book on the history of politics and Western thought, similar to a book by Alan Ryan. You can get these parts of this. There's this massive 2-volume study that Alan Ryan did on the history of Western political thought and its philosophy, and then these little books. I have about 6 of them that take the primary sources and tie them into the points in the book. These are all from Liverlight, but I think the original one's from Princeton. It's very good. And I want to do something like that, but with a more, how do we get to the politics of class from this politics? But I also realized that would be to do that well would be a project for the rest of my life. So I'm doing it here as a video form. So we'll see. But I'm writing again. So if you want to support me that way, you can find my writing. There's a Substack even where I post some stuff. If you don't have any money and you don't want to buy my book and you're sick of my shit, then you can go away. But let's say you're not sick of my shit, but you don't have any money, and I understand that a lot of people don't. And I try to produce this stuff for free, or at least make the videos for free on YouTube, because a lot of people use YouTube. Even though I don't put much effort in production values. You can just share and comment. Those help me a lot, actually. I don't always respond. I do usually look at them. I often get ideas for shows from them as well. So you're welcome to do that if you want to participate. I hope that you're getting something out of this. I'm worried that this much focus on Plato will turn people off, but I also think this is an ever-present resource, and there's lots of discussion. Like, Plato is super discussed everywhere. You can find this other places, but I do want to talk about, like, once you have an understanding of like the base kind of what might be considered the consensus reading of these books that I'm giving you right now, particularly the Republic, but we're also going to talk about the statesmen and the laws. You can look at its interpretation of history and how variant it gets, because I'm giving you, kind of a summary consensus interpretation right now. But with some of my own, a lot of my own spin. I mean, I am explaining like parallels and stuff that I don't necessarily see in other secondary sources, although not all of them are my own either. I will put the show notes with my secondary source references. But I think it's important for people to engage in this. So maybe I'll do it a while and break it up. I know a lot of people want me to talk about Mandani all the time, or whatever Sanders is doing, or President AOC, or what the DSA strategy should be. And I think a lot of reckoning what the DSA strategy should be has to deal with reckoning with what the DSA currently is and what the limitations are in the United States and how we would go about changing that. Because when people tell you something's impossible because of law, but also want to abolish capitalism, I'm always like, so how do you change law? Yeah, your enemies can do it. Why can't you? But making excuses but you're right about the law. So we'll talk more about that in the future too. So we will take breaks. I'm going to finish this series on the Republic, and we're going to take a break, and we're going to go to some other topics. And then I will come back to the interpretations, not all of them. I'm going to be selective here, of the Republic. And then we will move on to the next Platonic work that involves politics explicitly. I hope this gives people some background for dealing with politics. I didn't want to cover Plato originally. I want to start with Aristotle because Aristotle's politics is actually a little bit easier to articulate. And with Plato's, I find myself having to be very textual to show step by step how all these parallels and stuff emerge, the kind of geometric logic that undergirds it, how that undergirds everything. And this idea of the abstract being more real than the real, where it comes from. This idea of the dialectic, even us materialists in the Marxist world do have to admit that the dialectic, which is not unique to Plato, by the way, but as expressed by Plato, is one of the origins of our own political philosophy, even though it's highly modified through Aristotle and through Hegel and through Fichte and through Marx and through Feuerbach and through Hume and Hobbes. But a lot of it does start here, and it also parallels religious thought, and you should look at that. Like I always tell people, Plato's weirder than you think. That's why I've been pointing out that like Gnosticism, a lot of its categories come from the Republic. All right. Protect your peace.